In January of 1599, inside the cold stone walls of Westminster Abbey, workers dug a fresh grave. They placed it in a very specific spot, right next to the tomb of Geoffrey Chaucer. As the dirt was prepared, some of the greatest writers of the Elizabethan era stepped forward. They tossed their own handwritten elegies and the quills they wrote them with directly into the open pit to honor the man they called the Prince of Poets. To understand how a writer earns a funeral like that, we have to look back to the mid-1500s. At the time, English was largely considered a crude local dialect. It lacked the perceived grammatical sophistication and prestige of Latin or Greek. Enter Edmund Spenser. Born into a working-class London family, Spenser attended school as a designated poor boy, but he carried a massive ambition to elevate his native, unpolished tongue to the heights of classical literature. Spenser engineered an entirely new architectural framework from the English language, legitimizing it on the world stage. His first major attempt to restructure the language arrived in 1579 with the Shepheardes Calender. It is a collection of 12 distinct poems, each strictly corresponding to a different month of the year. Instead of copying the trendy continental styles of the day, Spenser deliberately reached backward. He used archaic diction, intentionally reviving older native English words, to weave a completely artificial, rustic feel into his verses. This tapped into the genre of the pastoral. By writing about shepherds in an idealized rural setting, he created a safe, allegorical space to heavily critique the sophisticated manners and politics of modern city life. By recycling the forgotten vocabulary of his own country, Spenser proved that English could sustain rich, complex literary worlds entirely on its own merits. Spenser sought the direct financial patronage and royal favor of Queen Elizabeth I. This image shows the title page of his solution, the Faerie Queene, published in 1590. It is a massive, epic poem stretching to over 36,000 lines. On a literal level, the poem follows various knights as they encounter tests of different virtues. Beneath the surface, it functions as a dense, allegorical piece of propaganda designed to flatter the queen and legitimize the Tudor dynasty. To construct a poem of this sheer size without it collapsing into repetitive monotony, Spenser had to invent a new mechanical tool, a verse form now known as the Spenserian stanza. He built each stanza using rigid mathematics. The first 8 lines use iambic pentameter, 10 alternating syllables. Then the architectural climax. The 9th line extends into iambic hexameter, 12 syllables. This longer line forces the reader to slow down, capping off the thought. Through this intricate rhythmic engineering, Spenser handed English poetry a standardized, majestic momentum. Looking at this vintage map of Ireland, we see the stark contrast to Spenser's idealized fairy worlds. In 1580, he traveled here to serve as a colonial administrator for the English forces, eventually acquiring an estate in the Munster region, built on confiscated lands. His political ambitions carried a heavy, brutal cost. He authored a controversial pamphlet arguing that Ireland could only be subdued if its indigenous customs were entirely destroyed, by violence if necessary. Yet, amidst the violent reality of his colonial surroundings, Spenser turned his poetic focus inward. He developed an obsession with his own aging, his mortality, and how much time he had left to cement a legacy. He channeled these anxieties into Amoretti, a sequence of love poems where he pioneered what is now called the Spenserian sonnet. It was a new structure designed specifically to process the complex power dynamics of desire and the relentless march of time. He interlocked his rhyme scheme tightly, bridging ABAB into BCBC, then CDCD, ending in a couplet, EE. He took this rigid control further in Epithalamion. He mathematicalized time, composing exactly 365 lines to perfectly match the days in a calendar year. Spenser viewed time as an unmanageable, devastating force. By locking his words into these strict mathematical constraints, he attempted to defeat time, physically freezing his life and his legacy in verse. Time and politics eventually caught up with him. During the 9 Years' War in 1598, his colonial life in Ireland violently collapsed when native rebels overran his estate and burned his castle to the ground. Spenser fled the blazing ruin and traveled back to London, carrying official letters detailing the desperate state of the Irish conflict. Just weeks later, in January 1599, he died. But while the physical markers of his life were destroyed, he received an entirely different kind of permanence in London. This marble memorial in Westminster Abbey honors the work he left behind. Spenser permanently injected a new level of standardization, rhythm, and lyrical sophistication into the English language. While his political ambitions turned to ash, Spenser achieved his ultimate goal, using the immortal architecture of poetry to elevate himself from a poor boy to the architect of the English Renaissance.